So today we've come to the last installment of the notes on the classical era empires, and we are going to be looking at the fall of the Roman Empire. So as I said, our topic for today is the fall of Rome, and we're going to be examining which factors, both internal factors and external, led to the fall of Rome. And this goes to our other essential questions and our compelling question about what empowers empires, and how our empires formed and maintained. In a sense, we'll be taking sort of a backward look at that today because it's a lack of those factors that ultimately lead to the dissolution of Rome. As you can see, there is a long list of internal problems or internal factors that were plaguing the Roman Empire toward the end, for the last 200 years at least. Take a minute and copy all these down, and then listen to the commentary that I'm about to offer, and you can add to those notes. So there's a lot here, and these factors are really sort of interconnected, so I'm not going to go through them as they're listed here. I'm going to kind of talk about them as I describe the situation in the western part of the Roman Empire that ultimately leads to the decline and the fall of the West. Again, I'm emphasizing that the empire splits into two parts around 284. Permanently splits into two parts. Actually, there was a huge crisis in the 200s. By 200 CE, Rome had ceased to expand. They had sort of reached their greatest extent, and now were beginning to contract. They were getting smaller and smaller as outside tribes began attacking and taking little pieces of the empire a little bit at a time. And ultimately, this is an enormous empire, and it's very difficult to administrate the entire thing. And so Western Rome actually experienced what's called the third century crisis from 235 to 284, almost 50 years, sort of in the middle of the 200s, where there's tremendous political instability. During that almost 50-year period, there were 26 different emperors, nearly all of which died by assassination or some sort of violence. And actually, in 260, the empire is split into three different provinces or three different pieces, but then is reunited again in 270. And then ultimately, in 284, Emperor Diocletian comes to power and is a stabilizing force to some degree. It ends that rocky period, 50-year period, and reunites the empire, but then ultimately splits it in a permanent half. There's an eastern part to the Roman Empire, and there's a western part, and there are actually two emperors. One rules in Rome itself, the city, and the other is going to be ruling in Constantinople. So the empire has been split by the late 200s. And one of the problems that the West is going to experience, obviously I mentioned that there's political corruption, there's instability, incompetence of a lot of the Western officials. And that's because the eastern part of the empire is wealthier. Much of the trade, overland trade that's coming along the Silk Roads and hits the Black Sea will stop in Constantinople. And Constantinople has a really strategic location. It's located along the Straits of Bosporus that ultimately connect the Black Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. So trade would come through those straits, those narrow straits, into the Mediterranean Sea and onto Rome. But with a second capital located right along those straits, much of the wealthy overland silk trade that's coming from the east is going to stop in Constantinople and not go all the way to the western capital anymore. The other economic problem that Rome itself faced is that the Roman Empire is no longer expanding. One of the sources of income for the western, for Rome in general, but especially for the western part of the empire, was loot. They would expand and conquer places and then loot those places. And they hadn't expanded for over 100 years. And so that was a loss of income. They also started to pay their army officials more. So they needed more income, and they actually had less of it. There's also a decline in trade in general. I mentioned there's a decline in trade coming to the city of Rome, that overland trade from the east. But there's also a loss of trade in Western Europe itself. Rome was becoming increasingly less safe to travel along those famous roadways that the Romans had created. There's internal unrest, there's uprisings, there's also attacks from outside that's making trade and travel much more difficult. And so there's less of it and thus less income in general in the empire. And so one of the things that during that crisis period of the 200s from 235 to 284, one of the things that some of those emperors did was devalue the coins that Rome had, specifically gold and silver coins, because they had only sort of a set amount of gold to create coins with, and they weren't adding to that. His income had dropped. They needed to find a way to make that gold last longer or stretch farther. So what they began to do was to what we call devalue that gold and silver as well. They cut the coins with less precious metals like lead or bronze or copper, so that, typically in a $1 gold piece, for example, you'd have $1 worth of gold. But what they were then doing is using only 50 cents worth of gold, because they had to make that gold stretch farther, make them more coins. So then they put 50 cents worth of gold in it, and then, cut the rest of it with lead or nickel or, some other less valuable material. So they're stretching their amount of gold there. Well, the problem with that is that creates rampant inflation. Inflation is a comprehensive rise of prices. So merchants began to realize that the gold coins, a $1 gold coin, was no longer really had a dollar's worth of gold in it. So if I'm a baker and I normally charge $1 for a loaf of bread, now I'm going to have to charge $2 to get a dollar's worth of gold out of it. So that creates a rise in prices in general. So that was a huge economic problem. And in fact, silver coins were devalued to such a degree that they were absolutely worthless by the late 200s. And a lot of small farmers or small businessmen had to resort to barter, because most people didn't trade in gold necessarily. They traded in silver. So what you end up having then, two other economic problems within Rome. Rome was an enormous empire, and they conquered a tremendous amount of territory, and they'd taken a lot of slaves, mostly prisoners of war. And so these slaves did a lot of the common labor. And more, slaves were doing much of the labor in the empire, and that threw a lot of people into unemployment. A lot of common laborers and farmers and things of that nature. And so Rome had established long time ago welfare handouts for unemployed people or people who were starving or that kind of thing. And so this became an increasing burden as more and more people were unemployed. Then the state had to pay, for all these people who were unemployed, their welfare benefits. And so ultimately, the state is going to have to raise taxes to continue to support all these people who are unemployed, because a lot of the work is done by slaves, and trade is coming crashing down, or it's grinding to a halt, and the economy, is not doing well. A lot of people then begin to flee from the west to the east. The east was much more attractive to live in the eastern part of the Roman Empire than the west. And so that's also what leads to this political corruption and incompetence in the west. And the army of questionable quality in the west is that all the quality army officials or government officials are going to the east, where it's more stable, where it's wealthier. And so the West, we see a general overall decline, sort of politically, socially, and economically. And the people then begin to reflect this disappointment and degeneration in the West. There's this apathy. People don't feel this sense of loyalty to Rome anymore as it starts to crumble. And, men didn't want to serve in the army. And so the West, an additional burden to the West economically, but also politically, is that they then had to hire mercenaries, which mercenaries are a bad thing. You're paying a lot for their services, and they are of questionable loyalty. So the quality of the Roman army, which had always been extremely high, begins to decline, certainly by the 300s. And we'll see that ultimately the Roman army is going to allow the conquest of much territory in the West, but also is going to allow the sack of the city of Rome itself. So there were a lot of internal factors that were leading to decline and decay of the western part of the Roman Empire. Ultimately, it's those external factors that are going to caused the complete destruction of the Western Roman Empire. There were numerous invasions, ultimately from tribes, especially Germanic tribes, although the Huns played an enormous part in weakening Rome. They swept through in the mid 400s, Attila, the Hun, the scourge of Rome, and really swept through the area of Gaul or France, around Italy, and tremendously weakened the empire and set it up ultimately for conquest. In 476, the city of Rome itself is sacked by a guy named Odoacer, who was of a Germanic tribe, and you can see a variety of Germanic tribes and European tribes, Visigoths, Vandals, the Franks, which is a Frankish or French tribe, are all picking away at the Roman Empire, but ultimately 476 is generally considered the date at which the city is sacked, and it's the date in which historians often mark the end of the western part of the Roman Empire. So again, to recap that, although the city of Rome and the organization of empire in the West ends in 476, it falls to invaders, and, in essence, centralized authority in the West and in Western Europe is going to collapse with the fall of the Roman Empire. The eastern part is going to live on for another 1,000 years, and they are ultimately going to be known historically now as the Byzantine Empire, and they will not fall until 1452 CE. So take a minute and go back and interact with your notes if you would. Circle, star, underline key vocabulary terms, key concepts, things that you think will show up on the test. Also, if you would do some interactions in the left-hand column with your notes, that would be great.